Rain poured down like cold, sharp knives, tearing through the gloomy March night. James stood by the window of his luxurious penthouse, the city lights blurred by the rain, reflecting in his deep black eyes. Tonight, for some reason, his heart felt heavy. A vague sense of unease crept into every breath, as if someone was whispering unclear warnings in his ear. He tightened his grip on a glass of whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid swirling, the only thing that helped him stay calm during his long, lonely days at the peak of fame. James was not one to be easily swayed by emotions. He had risen from the squalor of the slums, where the sound of gunshots and his mother Grace's cries were the mournful lullaby of his childhood. Now, at 32, he was a millionaire, a rare black man holding power in the world of arrogant white men. But wealth could not buy peace of mind. It could not buy the nights he did not dream of his mother, the woman who used to hold him close and sing to him amidst his father's drunken rages, his father who had long abandoned them. The phone rang, shattering the silence of the room. The sound was sharp, like a cut in the quiet space. James frowned, put the whiskey glass on the glass table, his hands slightly trembling as he reached for the iPhone. The screen displayed an unknown number. He hesitated. Who was calling at this hour? It was almost midnight, and he was not the type of person others could easily reach. But there was something in the ringing, urgent, desperate, that made his heart beat faster than usual. Hello. His voice was hoarse, tinged with caution. The other end of the line was silent for a second. Then a trembling voice rang out, weak as a dying wind. James, it's your mother. She's in danger. The person paused, their breathing heavy, mixed with the sound of rain drumming. Go to your stepfather's house right away. Hurry, before it's too late. James felt the blood in his body freeze. That voice, he didn't recognize it, but it pierced his chest like a rusty knife. Who is this? Who are you? What's wrong with my mother? He almost shouted, but the line had gone dead. The beeping sounded dryly, leaving him in a suffocating void where fear and confusion began to growl like a caged beast. His mother, Grace, the woman with calloused hands and a smile as gentle as the spring sunshine, who had sacrificed her whole life so he could step out of the darkness of poverty and discrimination. But now, she was far away from him, so far that he could no longer hear her voice in their weekly calls. It all started when she remarried Richard, a wealthy white man with cold eyes and a fake smile that James had never trusted. He had tried to stop her, had begged her not to step into that golden cage. But Grace just held his hand, her eyes filled with tears, and said, James, I need a place to lean on. You have your own life now. James had not forgiven her for that decision. Not because she chose Richard, but because she chose to leave him, to leave the days when they had relied on each other to survive. But now, as that strange voice echoed in his head, all resentment vanished, replaced by a sharp pain. His mother was in danger? Why? What had happened in the luxurious house he had never set foot in? He rushed out of the room, not even bothering to put on a raincoat. The sound of his shoes hitting the wooden floor echoed like drum beats in a funeral march. The car keys trembled in his hand, his palms wet with sweat despite the freezing cold. He didn't know where he was running. He only knew that if his mother was truly in danger, he would never forgive himself for standing still. The sleek black Bentley sped through the streets, rain hitting the windshield like ceaseless tears. James gripped the steering wheel tightly, his breath heavy. His mind was spinning with memories of his mother. Grace, with her shiny black curly hair, used to sit with him on long nights, telling him about her dreams. One day, her son would stand at the top of the world, where no one would dare to look down on him because of his skin color. She had believed in him, even when she herself was trampled by the world. But then Richard appeared. The man with the pristine white suit and a voice as smooth as oil, who had stepped into Grace's life like a savior. James remembered the first time he met Richard, the way he looked at him, contempt hidden behind a polite smile. "You're a promising young man, James," Richard had said, but his tone made James feel like a dog being patted on the head. He had warned his mother, had said that the man was not trustworthy. But Grace, with her soft heart and desire for a stable life, had chosen to believe Richard's promises. Now, as his car sped through the winding roads leading to the suburbs, James couldn't stop blaming himself. He had let his mother go. He had let her step into the arms of a man he always felt had something dark and evil hidden deep inside. If his mother was truly in danger, it was his fault, the fault of a powerless son, who only knew how to build his own empire and forgot the one who had sacrificed everything for him to have this day. The phone vibrated again. James jumped, almost swerving off the road. He turned on the speakerphone, his hand still gripping the steering wheel. "Hello, who is this?" He growled, his voice hoarse with tension. "James." It was that voice again, weak but more urgent. "Don't ask me who I am. Just get there now." "Richard, he won't stop." The voice was interrupted, as if the person was running or afraid of something. "Your mother, she's not herself anymore." Not herself anymore. James muttered, his heart clenching. Images of his mother flashed through his mind, Grace with her radiant smile, her strong hands that used to lift him up every time he fell. What did not herself anymore mean? What was wrong with her? Injured? Threatened? Or worse? He pressed the accelerator. The car roared like a wounded beast, lunging forward. The road to Richard's house was now just a few miles away, but every second felt like a century. The rain continued to fall, heavier, as if trying to drown the world in despair. James no longer thought about the danger of driving in this storm. He didn't care about the death that might lurk around every corner. Only one thing was on his mind: his mother. When he was a child, James had seen his mother cry. Not from hunger, not from poverty, but from the insults she had endured from the white people in the neighborhood. Dirty black. They used to shout at her when she asked for a job at the grocery store. James remembered how she held him tightly, her tears soaking his shirt, but she still said, "Don't hate them, James. Be stronger than them." That resilience had nurtured him, made him the man he was today. But now, if his mother, the strongest woman he knew, was in danger, what was there left in the world for him to fight for? The car headlights illuminated the sign, Oakwood Lane 2 miles. That was where Richard lived, where his mother had moved after the lavish wedding that James refused to attend. He had never been there, never wanted to set foot in the world he knew would not welcome him. But now, he had no other choice. As the car passed through the towering oak trees, James felt a cold chill run down his spine. Not from the rain, not from the wind, but from intuition. The intuition of a son who knew that the worst might be waiting for him ahead. He whispered to himself, "Mom, please be okay. I'm coming." The car stopped in front of a white mansion, as magnificent as a palace, but as cold as a tomb. The gate was unlocked, the iron door swaying slightly in the wind, emitting an eerie creaking sound. James turned off the engine, stepped out, letting the rain hit his face. He stood there, looking into the darkness ahead, his heart pounding as if it would burst. He didn't know what he would find in that house. Didn't know if that voice was trustworthy. But he knew one thing. If his mother was suffering, even for a second, he would tear everything apart to get her out of there. James took a deep breath, stepped through the gate, and let the darkness swallow him. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, each icy drop seeping through James's white shirt, clinging to his skin like invisible claws. He stood before the mansion's main door, his legs trembling not from the cold, but from the fear growling in his chest. This magnificent house, with its towering white columns and frosted glass windows, looked more like a palace than the place his mother Grace called home. But now, it exuded a gloomy, cold aura, like a tomb painted with a luxurious facade to hide the decay within. James placed his hand on the doorknob, the cold metal beneath his fingertips like a final warning. The door was unlocked. He frowned, his heart pounding. A man like Richard, arrogant, controlling, and obsessed with power, would never leave the front door wide open like this in the middle of the night. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in the silent space, echoing like the cries of a trapped soul. Inside, darkness swallowed everything. The faint light from the street lamps outside filtered through the windows, casting pale streaks on the marble floor. The air was heavy, damp, carrying the scent of old wood and something acrid that James couldn't define. He stepped in, his wet shoes leaving faint footprints on the floor, each step a stab at the deathly silence of the house. He called softly, his voice trembling, "Mom, where are you?" There was no answer, only the steady drumming of rain on the roof, like the heartbeat of a dying person. James took a deep breath, tried to calm himself. He couldn't let fear overwhelm him. Not now, when his mother might be somewhere in this house, needing him more than ever. But deep down, he felt a vague pain, the pain of a son who knew he might be too late. Then he heard it, a small, weak sound like a sob caught in the throat. It came from the end of the hallway, where the faint light led to the kitchen. James almost stopped breathing, his eyes wide in the darkness. The cry. He knew that cry. He had heard it thousands of times in his dreams, the cry of his mother, Grace, when she thought he was asleep and could no longer hear her pain. He rushed forward, no longer caring about being quiet or cautious. The sound of his shoes hitting the floor echoed urgently, blending with the frantic beating of his heart. "Mom," he shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. "Mom, it's me. I'm here." The kitchen door appeared before him, ajar, a faint yellow light seeping through the crack from an old lamp. James pushed the door open, and the scene before him froze him. Time seemed to stop. Space seemed to shrink, leaving only him and the painful image before his eyes. Grace, his mother, was kneeling on the kitchen floor. Her thin hands gripped a dirty rag, water pooling beneath her knees, soaking the tattered dress that was once blue, her favorite color, the color of the sky she used to say would be James's future. Her black curly hair, now tangled and matted with sweat, fell over her face. But he could still see the tears streaming down her thin cheeks, glistening like broken pearls in the lamplight. "Mom," James whispered, his voice breaking in his throat. He rushed to her, kneeling beside her, his trembling hands touching her shoulders. But Grace flinched, her body shrinking like a wounded animal afraid of the next blow. She looked up, her red eyes wide with panic, and for a moment, James felt his heart shatter. Those eyes that once shone with faith and love, were now empty, tired, as if all the light in her life had been extinguished. She was no longer the proud woman who had lifted him up from the darkest days. She was no longer the mother who used to sing him lullabies in her warm voice, who used to laugh at his pranks. The woman before him was now a shadow, a soul trapped in her own body. "James," she whispered, her voice as weak as a passing breeze. You shouldn't be here." She tried to push him away, but her hands trembled, devoid of strength. Tears fell again, faster, more, as if she was trying to wash away a pain she couldn't speak. Mom, what happened? James grabbed her hand, squeezing it, as if letting go would make her vanish into thin air. Why are you here like this? Where's Richard? What did he do to you? Grace shook her head, her lips pressed tightly to stifle a sob. Go, James. Go now before he... She paused, her eyes darting frantically towards the hallway, as if the darkness was hiding a lurking monster. He can't know you're here. You don't understand. You can't understand. I'm not going anywhere, James growled, his voice shaking with anger and pain. Look at yourself. You're crying. You're kneeling on the floor like a servant. I won't let you stay here another second. He tried to pull her up, but Grace was so weak that she fell into his arms, her breath ragged like a dying candle. James, my son, she whispered, her cold hand stroking his cheek. I didn't want you to see me like this. I didn't want you to know. Her voice trailed off, blending with her sobbing. But I have no choice. No choice. James held her tightly, his tears beginning to fall, hot on his cold face. Tell me, what did Richard do to you? Why are you here in this kitchen in the middle of the night like an outcast? Grace didn't answer right away. She bowed her head, her hair covering her eyes, but James could feel the pain tearing her soul apart. Then she whispered, her voice so soft that he had to lean close to hear. He doesn't see me as his wife. He sees me as something to command. A lowly black, as he says. Those words hit James like a knife to the heart. He let go of her, standing up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. What did he say? His voice trembled with rage, his eyes burning like an unquenchable fire. He dared to call you that? He dared to treat you like this? James, don't. Grace grabbed his hand, but he no longer heard anything. The blood in his body boiled, pain and anger merging into an uncontrollable storm. Richard, the white man with the fake smile and contemptuous eyes. James had suspected from the beginning, had sensed the evil hidden deep within him. But he didn't expect it to be this terrible, didn't expect it to turn his mother, the strongest woman he knew, into a trembling shadow on the cold floor. I'll find him, James growled, turning to rush out of the kitchen. I'll make him pay for what he did to you. No, Grace screamed, her voice breaking in the silent space. She clung to his leg, tears falling to the floor like raindrops in a storm. You don't understand, James. You don't know who he is. He'll kill you. He won't stop. James turned back, kneeling to hug his mother. He felt the desperation in her weak grip, in her trembling breath. You don't have to be afraid anymore, he whispered, his voice choked. I'm here now. I'll protect you. But deep down, James knew that promise might be a lie. This house, cold, gloomy, and full of secrets, was hiding something more terrible than he could imagine. And as he held his mother in his arms, listening to her cries blending with the rain, he felt the darkness closing in, ready to swallow them both. James knelt beside his mother, his arms wrapped tightly around Grace, as if she were the last piece of a crumbling world. Her cries, weak, choked, echoed in the cold kitchen, blending with the steady drumming of rain on the windows like a funeral dirge. He felt every tremor of her body, every tear soaking into his shirt, hot and painful like blood flowing from an unhealed wound. But in his heart, a fire of anger was raging, consuming all reason, leaving only a burning desire to find Richard and make him pay. Mom, I'm going to get you out of here, James whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of love and rage. He stroked her tangled hair, trying to find the image of the proud woman who was once everything to him. But Grace just shook her head, her red eyes filled with fear, her cold hands gripping his wrist like clinging to a buoy in a raging sea. "No, James, you don't understand," she said, her voice broken like a strangled wind. He won't let us go. You have to leave now." The desperation in her words was like a knife to his heart, but he couldn't listen. Couldn't leave her in this house, where darkness and pain had turned her into a shadow of herself. "I'm not going anywhere," James shouted, his voice echoing in the cramped space of the kitchen, drowning out the rain outside. "Look at yourself, kneeling on the floor, crying, afraid for what? For a bastard like Richard? I won't let you suffer anymore." He stood up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists, his eyes burning as if to scorch everything around him. But before he could step out of the kitchen, Grace grabbed his leg, falling to the floor. "James, don't!" she screamed, her cry breaking like a final plea. "You don't know him. He's more dangerous than you think. He'll kill you." Her tears fell onto the cold stone floor, forming mottled streaks like invisible bloodstains. James turned back, kneeling beside his mother again. He hugged her, feeling her body tremble in his arms. "You don't have to be afraid of him anymore," he whispered, his voice choked but determined. "I'm here now. I'll protect you, no matter the cost." But even as he spoke those words, he felt a cold dread run down his spine. Richard was not just a rich man. There was something in his mother's panicked voice, in her terrified eyes, that made him realize the man was a monster he had never faced. Then it came. Heavy, slow footsteps echoing from the hallway. Each step was like a hammer blow to the floor, resonating in the silence like a death sentence. James felt his mother shrink in his arms, her breath quickening, her hands gripping his shirt as if it were the last thread holding her to life. He looked up, his eyes narrowed in the darkness, his heart pounding as Richard's tall figure appeared in the doorway. Richard stood there, his cold blue eyes glinting in the dim light, like two emotionless ice chips. His white suit was rumpled, one hand holding a half-empty bottle of liquor, the other hanging loosely at his side. He tilted his head, looking at James with a contemptuous smile, slow and menacing. "Black boy," he growled, his voice low like the growl of a predator. "What are you doing in my house?" James felt the blood in his body boil. He called him Black Boy the way white people used to spit at his mother when she asked for jobs in the old neighborhood. The way the world always looked at him, at his mother, as lowly creatures unworthy of existence. He stood up, stepping in front of his mother to shield her, his hands clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms, drawing blood. "You have no right to call me that," James growled, his voice shaking with surging anger. "And you have no right to keep my mother here like an animal. I'm taking her away now." Richard laughed, a harsh, eerie laugh, echoing in the kitchen like a devil's tune. He staggered forward, the liquor bottle swinging like a weapon. "Take her away?" He repeated, his voice mocking. "Who do you think you are, boy? A hero? A dirty black like you has no place in my world." He pointed at Grace, his eyes flashing with a wicked gleam. "And her? She belongs to me. I bought her like buying a dog." Those words ignited James's last shred of reason. He lunged forward, thinking only of wiping that contemptuous smile off Richard's face. But before he could touch him, Grace screamed, throwing herself between them. "James, stop!" She hugged him, tears falling like rain, her body trembling as she held him back. "Don't do this. You don't understand. He won't spare you." Richard stood there, watching the scene with morbid amusement. He took a sip of liquor, then threw the bottle to the floor, the sound of shattering glass echoing like a warning. "Listen to your mother, boy," he said, his voice cold. "You don't know what you're getting into. I can crush you right here, and no one would care. A dead black in my house? The cops would thank me for taking out the trash." James clenched his fists, blood from his palms dripping onto the floor, mixing with the shards of glass. He wanted to rush at Richard, to smash that arrogant face, to make him feel the pain his mother had endured. But Grace's arms, weak but firm, held him back. He looked down, saw her eyes filled with pleading, and his heart was torn in two. "Mom, why are you protecting him?" James whispered, his voice hoarse with pain. "What did he do to you? Why won't he let me help you?" "Because I don't want to lose you," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're all I have, James. If you confront him, he'll destroy you. I'd rather die than see that." Those words were like a final knife to James's heart. He felt powerless, small, like a child lost in an inescapable storm. Richard stood there, smirking, his cold blue eyes looking at him like a cornered prey. "Go, boy," he said, his voice smooth but threatening. "You don't belong here, and your mother isn't going anywhere. She's mine." James looked at his mother, saw her head bowed, her tears falling ceaselessly. He wanted to scream, to smash everything, but her pleading eyes held him back. "I'll be back," he whispered to her, his voice choked. "I swear, Mom, I'll get you out of here." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, each step heavy as if carrying the weight of the world. Richard's laughter echoed behind him, sharp and cruel, like a reminder that the battle had just begun. But in James's heart, pain and rage had turned into an unquenchable fire. He could call him Black Boy, could insult his mother, but he didn't know that James would not stop, never stop, until his mother was free. As he stepped outside, the rain hit his face cold and painful, but he didn't feel it. Only the pain in his heart and the promise to his mother burned in his soul. James drove away from the mansion, the rain still pouring down as if to drown everything in despair. Richard's harsh laughter echoed in his head, cold and cruel, like a knife cutting into his soul. But what broke his heart was not the insult from that white man, but the image of his mother Grace kneeling on the floor, tears streaming down her face, her eyes filled with fear and sacrifice. He had promised to return, and that promise now burned like a fire in his chest, not allowing him to rest, not allowing him to give up. The Bentley sped through the dark roads, its headlights illuminating the thick rain, but James couldn't focus on driving. His mind was spinning with unanswered questions. Why was his mother so terrified? What had Richard done to turn her, the woman who had been his guiding light through the darkest days, into a trembling shadow? And who was the strange voice on the phone, the one who had warned him of danger? He gripped the steering wheel, his nails digging into his palms, blood mixing with sweat, but he felt no pain. Physical pain was nothing compared to the bleeding wound in his soul. He couldn't sit still, couldn't return to his luxurious penthouse, drink whiskey, and pretend everything was fine. His mother was there, in that cold house, enduring things he didn't dare imagine. James slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet road, stopping on a shoulder. He gasped for breath, his breathing blending with the sound of rain drumming on the roof. "I have to go back," he whispered to himself, his voice hoarse like a solemn oath. "I have to know the truth." The next night, when the sky was still heavy with dark clouds, James returned to the mansion. He didn't knock, didn't call. He knew Richard wouldn't let him in again without a fight. Instead, he parked several blocks away, put on a black hoodie to blend into the darkness, and quietly approached from the back. The rain had stopped, but the damp, cold air seeped through his clothes, making him shiver. Not from the cold, but from intuition, a terrifying intuition that what he was about to discover would change everything. The back door of the house was hidden under the shadow of an old oak tree, rusty and loose as if it had been forgotten for a long time. James pushed it gently, the hinges creaking softly, but not loud enough to alert anyone. He stepped in, his wet shoes leaving faint footprints on the old wooden floor. Inside, the space was pitch black, only the sound of wind whistling through the cracks like the breath of a dying person. He held his breath, listening. No footsteps, no eerie laughter from Richard. Only silence, a silence more terrifying than any sound. James tiptoed deeper into the house, his hands groping in the darkness. He didn't dare turn on the light, didn't dare leave any trace. Then he saw a small, low door, hidden behind an old rug in the corner of the hallway. It was unlike the other doors in the house, not painted white or carved with patterns. It was rough, dirty, like an entrance to a place no one wanted to set foot in. His heart pounded, a strange feeling taking over him. This was the place. He knew it, though he couldn't explain why. He knelt down, pulling the rug aside. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading into deep darkness. The smell of mold and something acrid wafted up, stinging his nostrils like a final warning. James took a deep breath, then stepped down, each footstep echoing like a drumbeat in a fateful melody. The cellar was pitch black, the air so heavy he fell short of breath. The flashlight beam swept across the mottled walls, full of cracks and cobwebs. In the corner of the room, an old wooden table was covered in dust, on which were things that made his heart skip a beat. Torn photos, crumpled pieces of paper, and a tattered leather-bound notebook. He stepped forward, his hands trembling as he picked up a photo. It was his mother Grace on her wedding day with Richard. Her smile, though strained, was still as bright as the sunlight he used to love. But the photo was torn in half, her face blackened with ink, as if someone wanted to erase her existence. James felt his throat tighten. He flipped through the other pieces of paper, invoices, contracts, debt records, all bearing his mother's name. The numbers were scribbled, the handwriting cold. Grace Turner debt to be paid by labor. He shuddered, not from the cold, but from the rising anger. What had Richard done? Had he turned his mother into a slave? A black woman, in his eyes, only worthy of being commanded and abused? Then he opened the notebook. The pages were yellowed, his mother's handwriting appearing under the flashlight, trembling and painful. June 12th, she wrote, Richard said I had to sign these papers, that it was the only way to keep James safe. I don't understand everything, but he threatened to destroy my son if I didn't obey. I signed, and now I'm a prisoner in my own home. James turned the page, his tears beginning to fall, hot on his cold face. August 3rd, he called me dirty black, said I wasn't worthy of being his wife. I have to mop floors, cook, do everything he tells me. If I resist, he'll find James. Each line was a knife to his heart. He knelt on the floor, the notebook falling from his hands, the sound of paper hitting the ground echoing dryly in the suffocating space. His mother had sacrificed everything, her dignity, her freedom, her soul, to protect him. But why? Why didn't she tell him? Why did she let him live in his luxurious world while she was dying in the dark? Then footsteps echoed above the stairs. Slow, heavy, like the beat of an evil heart. James jumped, turned off the flashlight, and rushed into a hidden corner behind an old wine barrel. His heart pounded, his breath quickened, but he tried to suppress it, not letting any sound escape. Light from the hallway shone down, and Richard's tall figure appeared at the top of the stairs. He stepped down, each step like a death sentence. In his hand was a wooden stick the tip stained with dried blood. James felt his blood freeze. He stopped in the middle of the cellar, his cold blue eyes scanning the darkness. "I know you're here, boy," Richard growled, his voice low like the growl of a beast. "You think you can sneak into my house without me knowing?" James held his breath, his body as tense as a taut string. Did he know he was here? Or was it just a threat? Richard smirked, his voice echoing in the suffocating space. "Your mother is a good dog, but you're not. You blacks are only fit to be slaves. I taught her that, and I'll teach you." Those words ignited James's last shred of reason. He wanted to rush out, to punch that arrogant face, to scream that he had no right to insult his mother. But he knew he couldn't. Not now, when he wasn't strong enough to confront him. Richard muttered something, then turned and walked up the stairs, his footsteps fading away, leaving James in the darkness with the terrifying secrets he had just discovered. He hugged the notebook, his tears falling ceaselessly. "Mom," he whispered, his voice choked. "I'll save you, I swear." But deep down, he knew this battle would not be easy. Richard was not just a racist, he was a monster, and the secrets in this cellar were just the beginning of the nightmare ahead. James huddled in the corner of the cellar, darkness enveloping him like a suffocating, heavy blanket. His mother's notebook graces lay in his hands, its thin pages soaked with his tears, as if they were crying with him. Richard's footsteps had faded away, but the coldness in the space still clung to him, seeping into every muscle, every wildly beating heart. He no longer heard the rain outside, only his own ragged breathing, mixed with the pain and rage growling in his chest. His mother's trembling words echoed in his mind, each word a knife to his heart. "I signed to keep James safe. He called me a dirty black. I have to do everything he tells me." Each word was a wound, each memory a fire scorching his reason. His mother, the woman who had sung him lullabies on hungry nights, who had held his hand through streets filled with prejudice, was now a prisoner of a man like Richard. And all of it was because of him. James clenched the notebook, his nails digging into the tattered leather cover, blood seeping from his palms, but he felt no pain. Physical pain was nothing compared to the pain tearing his soul apart. He had thought he was his mother's protector, that his success, the $1 million empire he had built from nothing, was proof that he had given her a better life. But now, he realized he was wrong, terribly wrong. He had left her in the hands of a monster, and she had endured it all in silence, just to keep him safe. He stood up, his legs trembling, but the determination in his heart was as hard as steel. The flashlight from his phone shone on the papers on the table, his mother's torn photos scattered like the ruins of a destroyed life. He picked up a contract, his eyes narrowing as he read the cold words. "Grace Turner agrees to relinquish all property rights in exchange for the protection of her son, James Turner." Below was his mother's signature, trembling and hesitant, as if she had struggled to the end before signing. James felt his throat tighten, tears flowing uncontrollably. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking in the silence of the cellar. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me live while you were dying in the dark?" He covered his face, hot tears flowing through his fingers, falling onto the cold stone floor, mixing with dust and unspoken pain. But then, amidst the storm of emotions, a memory flooded back. He remembered the day his mother left, the day she stood at the door of his small apartment, her eyes filled with tears, but her smile still as gentle as spring sunlight. "James, my son," she had said, her voice warm but trembling, "I need a place to lean on. You have your own life now. Let me live mine." He had been angry with her, had blamed her for choosing Richard instead of staying with him. But now he understood. She didn't leave because she wanted to. She left because she had no other choice. James turned the pages of the notebook, his hands trembling as he read the last lines. December 15th. He hit me today because I broke a glass. He said I was a stupid black, that I didn't deserve anything but contempt. I want to run away, but he threatens to find James to destroy everything my son has built. I can't let that happen. I'd rather die than see my son suffer. He stopped, the notebook falling to the floor, the sound of paper hitting the ground, echoing dryly like a choked sob. Richard had not only seized his mother's property, he had not only turned her into a slave in her own home, he had beaten her, insulted her, crushed every hope in her soul, and all because she was black, because in his eyes, she was not worthy of being considered human. James felt the blood in his body boil, the rage surging like a tsunami, sweeping away every remaining shred of reason. He stood up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists, his eyes burning like an unquenchable fire. "Richard," he growled, his voice hoarse, echoing in the dark cellar. "You'll pay. I swear. I'll make you feel the pain my mother has endured." But even as the oath left his lips, a vague fear crept into his heart. He was not just a racist. He was a monster with power and cruelty that James had never faced. James knelt down, picked up the notebook, hugging it like his mother's soul. He needed to confront Richard, needed to get his mother out of there. But how? He was stronger than he thought, more vicious than he imagined. And his mother, she had sacrificed so much, had endured for so long, would she still have the strength to escape this darkness with him? He stood up, wiping his tears with his sleeve, his determination stronger than ever. He left the cellar, his footsteps heavy but firm, carrying the notebook like living proof of the horrifying truth he had just discovered. The rain had stopped, but the air was still cold, seeping into his every breath. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. Tonight, everything would end one way or another. When he returned to his penthouse, it was almost dawn. The faint light of dawn shone through the windows, but it brought no warmth to his soul. He placed the notebook on the table, sat down in a chair, his trembling hands holding his head. The image of his mother kneeling on the kitchen floor flashed in his mind, her red eyes, her voice begging him to leave. But he couldn't abandon her, couldn't let her continue to live in the hell Richard had created. He picked up the phone, called a friend Marcus, a lawyer who had helped him with major deals. "Marcus," he said, his voice hoarse, "I need you. My mother, she's in danger. I just found something terrible." He recounted everything, every detail in the notebook, every insult Richard had hurled at his mother. Marcus was silent for a moment, then replied, "James, this is more serious than you think. If those documents are real, I can help you take him to court. But you have to be careful. He's not someone to be trifled with." "Careful?" James scoffed, his voice bitter. "I have nothing left to lose, Marcus. My mother is all I have, and he took her from me. I won't stop until he pays." He hung up, stood up, looking out at the city waking up below. But in his heart, there was no dawn, only darkness, the darkness of the horrifying truth he had just discovered. Richard was not just his mother's enemy. He was the embodiment of all the pain that black people like him, like his mother, had suffered in a world that never truly accepted them. And now, James knew that this battle was not just to save his mother, but to reclaim her dignity, her freedom, and her soul. He clenched the notebook in his hand, his eyes burning with a silent oath. "Mom, I won't let you suffer anymore. Even if it costs me my life, I'll get you out of there." But deep down, he felt a cold fear, the fear that this horrifying truth was just the beginning, and what awaited him ahead was darker than he could imagine. James stood before the mansion for the third time in 3 days, the darkness of night enveloping him like an inescapable shroud. His mother's notebook Grace's lay in his coat pocket, heavy as if carrying her very soul, the pain she had hidden for long, endless months. The rain had stopped, but the biting cold seeped through his hoodie, infiltrating his every breath. He was no longer afraid. Fear had been consumed by the fire of anger and burning love in his chest, a fire that only a son willing to die for his mother could understand. He had called Marcus, had prepared everything necessary to bring Richard to justice. But tonight, he didn't come with lawyers or police. Tonight, he came with the heart of a son, with hands ready to smash everything to reclaim his mother. He knew this was dangerous, knew Richard was not someone to be trifled with. But he no longer cared. Every line in the notebook, every tear his mother had shed on the kitchen floor, had turned him into a cornered beast, and that beast would not stop until its enemy fell. The front door was still unlocked, the iron gate swaying slightly in the wind, emitting a chilling creak like a threatening invitation. James stepped in, his shoes hitting the marble floor, each step echoing like a drumbeat in a fateful melody. He was no longer tiptoeing, no longer hiding. Tonight, he wanted Richard to face the wrath of a son whose mother he had dared to steal. "Richard," James shouted, his voice echoing in the silent space of the house, drowning out the wind whistling through the cracks. "Come out, you bastard. I know you're here." He walked down the hallway, his burning eyes scanning every dark corner, every closed door. There was no answer, only silence, a silence more terrifying than any sound. Then he heard a noise, a soft creak like metal rubbing against wood, coming from the living room at the end of the hallway. James clenched his fists, the blood in his body boiling, and he rushed forward. The living room door was wide open, light from the fireplace spilling out, dancing on the walls like ghosts mocking his fate. And there, in the middle of the luxurious room, with leather sofas and ebony bookshelves, Richard sat in an armchair, his cold blue eyes looking at him like prey. He didn't stand up. He just sat there, holding a half-smoked cigar, white smoke swirling around his arrogant face. A contemptuous smile spread across his lips, slow and menacing. "Black boy," he said, his voice low like the growl of a predator. "You've got guts coming back to my house after last time." James didn't answer. He stepped forward, each step heavy as if carrying the weight of the world. "What did you do to my mother?" He growled, his voice shaking with surging anger. "I read her notebook. I know everything, the papers you made her sign, the times you beat her, the words you used to insult her, just because she's black. Who do you think you are, huh? A lord in this sick castle?" Richard laughed, a harsh laugh echoing in the room, eerie like an echo from hell. He took a puff of his cigar, then stood up, tall and imposing in his rumpled white suit. "You know what, boy?" he said, his voice mocking. "Your mother was an item. I bought her with money, with promises, and she obediently bowed her head. You blacks were born to serve, that's the law of nature. You think you can change that?" Those words ignited James's last shred of reason. He lunged forward, thinking only of wiping that contemptuous smile off Richard's face. But before his fist could touch him, Richard pulled a gun from a drawer beside him, the black muzzle pointing straight at his chest. "Slow down, boy," he growled, his finger on the trigger. "You think you can threaten me? A black like you in my house doesn't stand a chance." James stopped, his breath ragged, his burning eyes staring straight into the barrel. He wasn't afraid of death. Not now, when his mother was still somewhere in this house, enduring pain he couldn't imagine. "Shoot," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. You shoot me, but you won't get away with it, Richard. I have proof, my mother's notebook, the papers you made her sign. You'll pay, whether I live or die. Richard smirked, his blue eyes flashing with a wicked gleam. You're so naive, he said, stepping closer, the gun barrel just inches from James's chest. Who do you think will believe you? A black against me, a rich, powerful white man? The law is on my side, boy. You and your mother are just trash in her eyes. James clenched his fists, blood from his palms dripping onto the floor, mixing with the red glow from the fireplace. He wanted to lunge, to risk everything, but then a sound came from behind, hurried footsteps, panting breaths. He turned around, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw his mother Grace rushing into the room, her eyes red, holding a trembling kitchen knife. James! She screamed, her voice breaking in the suffocating space. She rushed forward, standing in front of him, the knife pointing at Richard. Don't touch my son, she growled, her thin body trembling, but her eyes burning with a strength James hadn't seen since she left him. Richard looked at her, the smile on his lips fading, replaced by a cold anger. You dare hold a knife to me, you dirty black? He growled, raising the gun, aiming at Grace. I gave you a home, a life, and you dare betray me? James lunged, pushing his mother out of the line of fire, just as the gunshot rang out. The bullet grazed his shoulder, hot and painful, but he didn't care. He fell to the floor, pulling Grace with him, hugging her tightly. Mom, are you okay? He whispered, his voice choked as blood from his shoulder soaked her shirt. Grace nodded, her tears falling ceaselessly. James, I'm sorry, she whispered, her trembling hand stroking his cheek. I didn't want you to get involved in this. Richard stepped forward, the gun still pointing at them, his eyes flashing with madness. How touching, you too, he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But you think you can win against me, boy? I'll shoot you both, and no one will care. A simple self-defense, who's going to doubt me? James held his mother tightly, blood from his shoulder dripping onto the floor, but he didn't let go. He looked straight into Richard's eyes, his eyes burning with a silent oath. You're wrong, he growled. I won't let you win. Never. Then, in a flash, Grace broke free from his grasp, lunging at Richard with a knife in her hand. Enough, she screamed, her voice breaking like the cry of a soul imprisoned for too long. The knife pierced Richard's shoulder, not deep, but enough to make him howl in pain, the gun falling to the floor. He stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, dark red blood spreading on his white suit. James lunged, picked up the gun, pointing it straight at Richard. He lay there, gasping for breath, his blue eyes now filled with fear instead of arrogance. You won't dare shoot me, Richard growled, his voice hoarse with pain and panic. You're just a cowardly black. James tightened his finger on the trigger, his hand trembling, but he didn't shoot. He looked at his mother, saw her kneeling on the floor, her tears falling ceaselessly, her trembling hands holding the bloody knife. James, don't, she whispered, her voice weak. Don't turn into someone like him. He looked at her, his heart breaking at the pain in her eyes. He dropped the gun, knelt down, hugging her, blood from his shoulder mixing with her tears. Mom, I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice choked. I can't lose you. Richard lay there, groaning in pain, but James no longer cared. He hugged his mother tightly, feeling her weak breath in his arms. This confrontation was not a victory. It was a deep wound in his and his mother's souls, a wound that might never heal. The living room was filled with the smell of blood and cigar smoke, the light from the fireplace dancing on the wooden floor like ghosts witnessing a fateful moment. James knelt on the floor, his trembling arms wrapped tightly around his mother Grace, while blood from his shoulder soaked her shirt, mixing with their tears. The bloody knife lay nearby, its steel blade glistening in the red light, a reminder of the desperate act she had just performed. Richard lay a short distance away, clutching his shoulder and groaning, blood seeping from the stab wound, his white suit now stained red, a symbol of his crumbling arrogance. Grace's scream still echoed in James's head, sharp and painful. Enough! It wasn't just a scream against Richard, but a cry for help from a soul that had been imprisoned for too long, a mother willing to do anything to protect her son. He hugged her tighter, feeling her thin body tremble in his arms, her breath ragged like a dying candle. "Mom, are you okay?" he whispered, his voice choked, tears falling ceaselessly on his cold face. Grace looked up, her red eyes meeting his, but the fear he had seen earlier was gone. Instead, there was a deep sadness, a mixture of determination and pain that only a mother could bear. She placed her trembling hand on his cheek, her cold fingers gently caressing him, as if trying to memorize every line on her son's face. "James," she whispered, her voice as weak as a passing breeze. "I don't want you to get involved in this. I don't want you to see me like this." "Don't say that," James interrupted, his voice breaking in his throat. He took her hand, squeezing it as if letting go would make her vanish into thin air. "I'm here for you. I came to get you out of here. You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'll protect you, just like you've always protected me." But even as he spoke those words, he felt a cold dread run down his spine. The blood from his shoulders still flowed, hot and painful, but he didn't care. Only his mother, the woman in his arms, was all he had left in the world. Grace shook her head, tears falling again, streaming down her thin cheeks. "You don't understand, James," she said, her voice broken as if each word was a final effort. "I let him control me, to protect you. He threatened to find you, to destroy everything you've built. I couldn't let that happen. I'd rather die than see you suffer." Those words were like a knife to James's heart. He was stunned, his eyes wide as he looked at his mother, his heart clenched by the horrifying truth she had just revealed. All those months she had spent scrubbing floors. All those times she had cried secretly in the cold kitchen, the wounds he had never seen on her body all for him. She had sacrificed herself so he could live, could rise in a world that always tried to push him down because of his skin color. "Mom," James whispered, tears flowing uncontrollably. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me live while you were suffering like this?" He hugged her tighter, feeling the faint warmth of her body fading, like a dying flame in a cold wind. "I'm your son. I should have protected you, not the other way around." Grace smiled a weak, sad smile, but full of love. "You're my light, James," she whispered, her hand stroking his cheek one last time. "Every day I saw you succeed, I knew I had done the right thing. But I couldn't let him continue. I couldn't let him touch you." Before James could respond, she broke free from his grasp, lunging at Richard with a strength he didn't expect from her frail body. "No!" he screamed, but it was too late. Grace picked up the knife from the floor, her hands trembling but her eyes determined, and stabbed again. Richard howled, a groan of pain echoing in the room as the knife plunged deep into his chest. Blood spurted out, dark red and hot, staining Grace's hands, staining the wooden floor, staining James's world. Richard collapsed, his cold blue eyes wide in horror, then slowly closed. He lay there, motionless, blood spreading into a large pool, the light from the fireplace reflecting on the red surface like a scene from hell. Grace dropped the knife, her body staggering, then collapsed on the floor beside Richard's body, her breath ragged like a dying candle. Mom. James lunged forward, kneeling to hug her, tears falling like rain on her face. Mom, why? Why'd you do that? He screamed, his voice breaking in unspoken pain. He held her in his arms, feeling her body go limp, blood from her hands soaking in his shirt, mixing with the blood from his shoulder wound. Grace looked up, her eyes fading but still trying to see him. For you, James, she whispered, her voice so weak he had to lean close to hear. I couldn't let him live, couldn't let him hurt you. I'm sorry for letting you see me like this. She paused, a final breath escaping her trembling lips, and then her eyes closed, her face peaceful as it had never been before. Mom, James cried out, his scream shattering the silence, echoing in the room filled with blood and pain. He hugged her tightly, shaking her as if he could bring her back, but Grace didn't answer. She was gone, leaving him, leaving the unjust and cruel world she had fought to protect him from until her last breath. He sat there, holding his mother, tears falling ceaselessly, mixing with the blood on the floor. Richard was dead. The man who had turned his mother's life into hell had fallen at her hands. But this victory brought no joy, no relief. It only left an unfillable void in James's heart, a deep wound that he knew would never heal. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered, his voice choked in his throat. I was too late. I couldn't save you. He leaned down, kissing her forehead, his tears soaking her tangled hair. He had promised to get her out of there, but now she had left in the only way she could by death, by the ultimate sacrifice to protect him. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone in the neighborhood must have heard the gunshot, the screams, and called them. James didn't care. He sat there, holding his mother, blood and tears blending into a river of pain. As the red and blue lights of the police car flashed through the windows, he still didn't let her go. He couldn't let her go, not now, not when she had spent her whole life keeping him alive. The door burst open, hurried footsteps echoed, and strange voices shouted, "Hands up! Put your hands up!" But James heard nothing. He just looked at his mother, her face peaceful in his arms, and whispered, "Mom, I love you. I won't let your death be in vain." That tragic moment was not just the death of Richard, not just the death of Grace. It was the death of a part of James's soul, the part he had spent his life protecting, loving, and now was gone forever in this room filled with blood and pain. The red and blue lights of the police car flashed through the windows, illuminating the living room in flickering streaks like the heartbeat of a dying world. James knelt on the floor, holding his mother Grace tightly in his arms, her body growing cold, her eyes closed forever in a peace she had never known in life. Blood from his shoulder, from her hands, from Richard's body spread across the wooden floor, blending into a dark red painting of pain and sacrifice. Police sirens wailed outside. Hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway, but James heard nothing. Only the pounding of his heart in his chest, mixed with the choked sobs he couldn't suppress. "Police! Hands up!" A sharp voice rang out as the door burst open, and 3 officers rushed in, guns pointed at James. The light from their flashlights shone into his eyes, blinding and cold, but he didn't move. He still held his mother, his trembling hands gripping her, as if letting go would make her vanish forever. "Take your hands off that woman. Now!" The police chief shouted, his voice tense, but James didn't answer. He just leaned down, whispering in his mother's ear, "I'm sorry, Mom. I couldn't protect you." "He's wounded," Another officer said, the flashlight beam sweeping across James's shoulder, where blood still seeped from the bullet graze. There are 2 dead here. Call for paramedics now. Chaotic footsteps echoed, the crackle of radio communication with headquarters, but all were distant sounds to James. He didn't care about the police, didn't care about the wound on his shoulder. Only his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, was the only reality in his shattered world at that moment. You there, stand up. The police chief stepped forward, placing a hand on James's shoulder, his voice less harsh but still firm. We need your cooperation. What happened here? James looked up, his red eyes meeting the officers, but he said nothing. How could he explain? How could he tell the story of a mother who had endured hell to protect her son, of a man like Richard who had crushed her soul because of her skin color? How could he put the pain tearing his heart apart into words? Finally, he let go of his mother, his trembling hands leaving her cold body. He stood up, staggering like a ghost, blood from his shoulder dripping onto the floor, mixing with Richard's pool of blood. I tried to save her, he whispered, his voice hoarse like a confession. Richard, he attacked us. I pushed my mother out of the way of the bullet, but she stabbed him to protect me. He paused, tears falling again, hot on his cold face. He didn't tell the whole truth, didn't say that Grace had stabbed Richard a second time, that she had chosen his death to end the nightmare. He couldn't let his mother be judged, couldn't let this world tarnish her any further. The police chief frowned, looking from James to Richard's body, then to Grace. Self-defense with 2 stab wounds? He muttered, his voice suspicious. We'll have to investigate. You need to come with us to the station now. James nodded, not resisting. He let them handcuff him, the cold metal biting into his skin, but he felt no pain. The pain in his heart had overwhelmed everything. As they led him out of the house, the flashing lights of the ambulance lit up the night, the sirens wailing like a funeral song. James turned back, taking one last look at the room where his mother lay, motionless on the floor. She was gone not in pain or fear, but in the peace of a mother who knew her son would live. But the price of that peace was too high, too cruel, and James knew he would never forgive himself for letting her pay it. At the police station, the cold white fluorescent light shone on James's face, highlighting his red eyes and the dry blood on his shirt. He sat in the interrogation room, his handcuffed hands on the metal table, silent as a shadow. The police chief, a white man with salt and pepper hair, sat opposite him, flipping through the report pages with a cold expression. James Turner, he said, his voice even. Famous black millionaire, huh? Now you're here, with 2 bodies in your stepfather's house. You say it was self-defense, but it's not that simple. The woman your mother stabbed, Richard Carter twice. We need the truth. James looked up, his eyes burning with an unquenchable fire. The truth? He growled, each word like a knife. The truth is my mother was imprisoned in that house, beaten, insulted just because she was black. The truth is Richard tricked her into signing papers to seize her property, threatened to destroy me if she didn't obey. The truth is tonight, he tried to shoot us both, and my mother sacrificed her life to save me. Is it the truth you want to hear? The police chief frowned, silent for a moment, then wrote something in his notebook. If you have evidence the notebook you mentioned, give it to us, he said, his voice less harsh. But even if you're telling the truth, things are still complicated. She killed someone, James. Self-defense or not, we have to investigate. James scoffed, his voice bitter. Investigate? What will you do? Paint a story that my mother was the aggressor, that she attacked an innocent white man? I know how this system works. I know it will never side with my mother or me. He paused, tears welling up again, but he didn't wipe them away. but I won't let my mother be tarnished. She's the victim, not the perpetrator." The officer sighed, putting down his pen. "I'm not here to argue with you, James. We'll examine the scene, take statements, and review the evidence. But you need to prepare yourself. If your mother caused Richard's death, the consequences won't be light." James didn't answer. He bowed his head, his hands clenched into fists under the handcuffs, his nails digging into his skin. Consequences. The word echoed in his head like a funeral bell. His mother was dead. She had sacrificed everything to protect him, and now, even in death, she had to face the judgment of a world that had never been fair to her. He felt powerless, small, like a child lost in an inescapable storm. Then the interrogation room door opened, and Marcus walked in, his black suit neatly pressed, but his face filled with worry. "James," he said, his voice urgent, "I heard everything from the police. I brought the notebook, I copied it, and gave the original to them. What your mother wrote. It's enough to prove she was coerced, abused. I'll do everything to protect her honor, I swear." James looked up, his red eyes meeting Marcus's. "Protect her honor?" He whispered, his voice broken with pain. "She's dead, Marcus. She died in my arms. Because of me, no honor can bring her back." He bowed his head, tears falling onto the metal table, forming small glittering streaks in the cold light. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice low. "I know, James. I know nothing can make up for it, but I won't let your mother be seen as a murderer. I'll hire the best lawyers. I'll fight this system. You're not alone. You hear me?" James nodded, but in his heart, he knew he would be forever alone. His mother, the only light in his life, was gone, and no lawyer, no evidence could erase that pain. He looked at Marcus, then whispered, "Just do what you can. But I just want my mother to rest in peace, without judgment, without further insult." As Marcus left, James sat there, alone in the cold interrogation room. He thought of his mother, of her gentle smile, of her calloused hands that had held him through hungry days. He had chosen to return to that house, had chosen to confront Richard, and now, the consequence of that choice was his mother's death. He wondered if he could have done things differently, if he could have saved her if he had come sooner, if he hadn't let her fall into Richard's hands in the first place. But there were no answers, only pain, and a silent oath in his heart. "Mom, I'll fight for you. Even if this world is against me, I won't let them tarnish you." He closed his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks, and in the darkness of his soul, he saw his mother peaceful, free, but forever out of reach. The trial took place on a bleak April morning, the sky heavy with clouds, as if trying to crush the world beneath. James sat in the front row, his hands no longer cuffed but still trembling, resting on his lap as if trying to hold on to something lost forever. The black suit he wore, forced upon him by Marcus to look more credible, felt alien and suffocating on his body. He was no longer the proud millionaire who once stood at the top of the world. He was a son who had lost his mother, a broken soul facing the judgment of a system he knew would never side with him. The courtroom was cold, the light from the high windows casting pale streaks across the marble floor, reflecting James's tired face in faint glimmers. The judge's gavel echoed, sharp and dry, like a final stab into his heart. His mother's notebook graces lay on the evidence table, its yellowed pages containing her pain and sacrifice now being flipped through by unfamiliar hands, emotionless eyes. Marcus sat beside him, his eyes filled with determination, but James no longer had hope. He had seen how this world worked, how it always sought to crush people like him, like his mother. The prosecutor, a white man with slicked back hair and a smooth voice, stood up, looking towards the jury with a polite but cold smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice even as if reading a pre-written script, "we have a clear case of domestic violence leading to the death of Mr. Richard Carter, a successful man, a pillar of the community. The woman, Grace Turner, stabbed him not once, but twice in his own home. Despite the defendant James Turner's claim of self-defense, we cannot ignore the fact that this was a deliberate attack, an unacceptable act of violence." James clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, blood seeping out, but he felt no pain. "Violence?" he whispered, his voice hoarse, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "They call my mother violent when she lived in hell to protect me." Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Calm down, James. Let me handle this." But James couldn't calm down. How could he sit still while his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything, was being tarnished even in death? His lawyer stood up, Marcus's voice ringing out strongly, but unable to hide the tension. "Your Honor, Grace Turner was not violent. She was the victim of a ruthless abuser, Richard Carter. This notebook," he pointed to the evidence table, "is living proof of the years she was abused, forced to sign away her property, beaten and insulted just because of her skin color. That night, she acted to protect her son, James Turner, when Richard Carter pointed a gun at them. This was not murder, this was self-defense, the final cry of a mother." The jury was silent, their blank faces looking towards Marcus, then towards James. He could see their eyes, suspicious, cold eyes that he had seen thousands of times in his life. They didn't see him as a millionaire, didn't see his mother as a loving mother. They saw her, as black people carrying inherent guilt, as shadows unworthy of trust in a world built by people like Richard. The prosecutor scoffed, stepping in front of the jury. "We can sympathize with Grace Turner's situation," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "But the law does not operate on emotions. She took a knife, stabbed Mr. Carter twice, once when he was already injured. That is not self-defense, that is intent to kill. And James Turner, while not directly causing the death, was present at the scene, involved in the events that led to this tragedy. We recommend Grace Turner be convicted of manslaughter, even posthumously, to establish legal responsibility." James jumped up, his chair crashing behind him, the sound of wood hitting the floor echoing loudly. "Convict my mother?" he roared, his voice shaking with uncontrollable anger and pain. "You dare call her a murderer? She saved me. She endured everything so I could live. You don't understand anything." Marcus pulled him down, whispering urgently, "James, stop. You'll make things worse." But James didn't care. He looked straight into the prosecutor's eyes, the jury's eyes, the judge's eyes, his eyes burning with a silent oath. He would not let his mother be judged as a criminal. The trial dragged on for hours, but for James, it was like a never-ending nightmare. The accusations, the cold arguments, the contemptuous glances, all like knives stabbing into his heart, tearing apart what was left of him after his mother's death. When the jury retreated to the closed room to deliberate, James sat there, his head in his hands, tears silently falling to the floor. He no longer had the strength to cry aloud. Only pain and helplessness imprisoning him in his own body. They returned after 2 hours as long as 2 centuries for James. The jury foreman, a white woman with a blank face, stood up, reading the verdict. "We find Grace Turner guilty of manslaughter in a state of extreme emotional disturbance. Although she is deceased, this verdict will be recorded in the legal record. James Turner is not charged, but is considered a key witness in the case." The judge's gavel echoed, ending the trial, But for James, it was like an explosion shattering all remaining hope. His mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything, was convicted of manslaughter. Her honor, the last thing he wanted to protect, was tarnished by a system that never understood her pain, his pain. Marcus patted his shoulder, whispering, "I did my best, James. At least you weren't charged." But James didn't answer. He stood up, leaving the courtroom, his feet heavy as if carrying the weight of the world. The next day, James stood before the prison where his mother was buried, not in a peaceful cemetery, but in a cold corner of land reserved for unclaimed prisoners. Her grave was just a small marker, engraved with the simple words, Grace Turner, 1965 to 2025. No flowers, no candles, nothing but the emptiness and pain James carried in his heart. He knelt down, placing his hand on the marker, tears falling onto the dry ground, seeping into the dirt like invisible drops of blood. "Mom," he whispered, his voice choked in his throat. "I'm sorry. I couldn't protect you. Couldn't keep your honor. I failed." He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He had promised to bring her out of the darkness, but now she lay here in an unmarked grave, judged by the world as a criminal. He stood there for hours, under the gray sky devoid of light. The wind blew, cold and cruel, but he didn't feel it. Only pain and the unanswered question, could he change anything? Could he make this world recognize his mother's sacrifice, or would it forever be a story buried under the dust of injustice? James stood up, his red eyes looking towards the horizon. He was no longer the man who once stood at the peak of fame. He was a shadow, a soul imprisoned by pain and loss. But deep down, he knew he couldn't stop. He would continue to live, continue to fight not for himself, but for his mother, for people like her, who were trampled by this world just because of their skin color. He turned, walking away from the grave, each step heavy but determined. This ending was bitter, cruel, but it wasn't the end. It was a promise that James would not let his mother die in vain, that he would use his life to fight the injustice that had taken her from him. And in his heart, Grace still lived not as a manslaughterer, but as a mother, a warrior, a light that would never go out. The story of James and Grace is more than just a family tragedy. It is a mirror reflecting the painful corners of society, where love, sacrifice, and injustice intertwine into a mournful symphony. From the impoverished streets where James grew up in his mother's calloused arms, to the cold mansion where Grace endured hell to protect him, their journey is a story of the strength of maternal love facing the cruelty of the world. The deeper meaning of the story lies not in Richard's death or the court's verdict, but in how it exposes the fragility of humanity when pushed to the edge by discrimination, power, and pain. James, a black millionaire standing at the pinnacle of fame, seemed to have escaped the shadows of the past, but was ultimately pulled back by the invisible strings of racism and injustice, strings his mother had spent her life trying to sever. Grace, the mother with a smile as gentle as spring sunlight, is the heart of this story. She is not just a victim, she is a symbol of the silent sacrifice that millions of mothers around the world carry. When she signed the papers relinquishing her property, when she knelt to scrub floors in the cold kitchen, when she took a knife to Richard to protect James, she didn't think of herself. Each of her actions was a wordless whisper. My son is worth living. The meaning of that sacrifice goes beyond the tattered diary pages or the tears on the floor. It reminds us that a mother's love knows no bounds, that it can be so powerful as to turn pain into strength, despair into action. But tragically, That sacrifice is not recognized by the world. It is buried under the cold verdict of a legal system that doesn't understand, doesn't care about the broken heart of a black woman. Richard, the villain in the story, is not just an evil individual, he is the embodiment of the racism and oppressive power that have been ingrained in society for centuries. He called Grace dirty black, turned her into a slave in her own home, not because she was weak, but because he believed her skin color made her undeserving of human treatment. The meaning of this character lies in his representation of an ideology that still silently exists, hidden beneath the civilized veneer of the modern world. His death at Grace's hands is not a victory, it is a warning that injustice, when pushed to the limit, will lead to unavoidable tragedies. But the price of that tragedy, as the story shows, often falls on the most innocent, those like Grace, who fight not for themselves, but for what they love. James, the son carrying both pride and pain, is the central character through whom we see the conflict between love and helplessness. He rose from poverty, built an empire with his own hands, but ultimately, he couldn't save his mother from the darkness she willingly stepped into for him. The meaning of James's journey lies in the belated realization, that money and fame cannot buy safety for those he loves, that his power, no matter how great, is not enough to fight a world ready to judge his mother simply because she is black. When he stood at her grave, tears falling on the dry ground, he didn't just cry for his mother, he cried for himself, for a part of his soul lost forever, and for the dreams he once believed he could turn into reality. The first lesson the story offers is the value of family, love a love that can transcend all boundaries, all pain, but is also vulnerable to the cruelty of the outside world. Grace spent her life protecting James, but he only realized it when it was too late. This lesson reminds us not to wait until we lose them to cherish those we love. James could have told his mother he loved her, could have pulled her out of that house sooner, but he let busyness, anger, and misunderstandings cloud his heart. When he held her in the blood-soaked room, when he saw her take her last breath, he understood that nothing in the world is more precious than the moments we have with those we love, and that sometimes we only realize that when we no longer have the chance to make amends. The second lesson is that injustice never completely disappears, it only changes shape, hiding in systems, in glances, in seemingly harmless words. The trial that convicted Grace of manslaughter, even in death, is proof of a bitter truth. In the eyes of the law and society, people like her black people, poor people, oppressed people are often not seen as victims, but as criminals. James, despite being a millionaire, was powerless against that system because his and his mother's skin color predetermined their fate in the eyes of those in power. This lesson is not to make us despair, but to urge us to fight for justice, for fairness, even if the road is full of thorns and tears. The third lesson, and perhaps the most painful, is that the price of sacrifice is sometimes too great for those left behind to bear. Grace chose Richard's death, chose to end her nightmare with her own hands, so James could live. But her death did not bring him relief. It left an unfillable void, a pain he would carry for life. This lesson teaches us that sacrifice, no matter how noble, does not always lead to happiness. It reminds us that sometimes the best way to protect those we love is not to silently endure, but to face the darkness together, so no one has to bear the pain alone, so no one has to leave in loneliness like Grace. Finally, the story leaves an unanswered question. Can we change this world? James stood at his mother's grave, tears falling on the dry ground, wondering if he could do anything to restore her honor, to keep people like her from being forgotten in the shadows of injustice. He had no answer, but he chose to keep living, to keep fighting not for himself, but for his mother, for those trampled by this system. The meaning of that choice lies in resilience, the resilience of a son carrying pain, but not letting it defeat him. The lesson here is that even if the ending is bitter, even if the world is cruel, we must stand up, must keep moving forward, because only when we don't give up will sacrifices like Grace's truly have meaning. The story of James and Grace does not have a happy ending. It does not end with laughter or the bright light of victory. It ends in tears, in loss, in a cold grave under a gray sky. But it is that bitterness that makes it real, relatable to those who have felt the pain of injustice, of love tested by the world. Its meaning lies not in everything being resolved, but in how it forces us to look at ourselves, to look at those we love, to look at the society we live in, and ask, what can we do to avoid standing at a grave, crying for things that cannot be fixed? And the final lesson, simple but profound, is to live without regrets, because time does not wait, and those we love can leave at any moment, taking our hearts with them.